We are live on YouTube now.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nathan Fabian. I'm the chair of the platform on sustainable finance. This is our second report launch for this week. Thank you for joining us. Today, the platform will launch our report on new criteria for the environmental taxonomy, and that is specifically for transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. We call these the Taxo 4, and they add to the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation criteria, which are already in law. Now, in launching our report, we are providing more opportunities for new sectors of the economy to demonstrate that they are substantially contributing and doing no significant harm to Europe's sustainability objectives. The European Commission gave a mandate to the platform in October 2020 to conduct this work, and we've been working on these criteria since that time. Now, I know that many in the audience will be wondering when our recommendations might become law and required in reporting. The timeline as it stands is that the Commission will review this report and the recommendations and make its own proposal for a delegated act towards the end of 2022. The Commission will, of course, advise us all on its timing as we go through the next weeks and months. I'd like to say that, as is our usual approach, this is a long report today. And that is because when we publish our recommendations, we include our rationale to properly explain why we have come to the criteria recommendations that we have. Now, please do not fear. Those of you who know the taxonomy well will be aware of something called the EU Taxonomy Compass. And if you haven't seen that before, I encourage you to have a look in the browser, EU Taxonomy Compass, and then you'll see how the criteria can be presented in a simpler form once they are ready in what we call the delegated acts or in law and require reporting. But this report we will launch today, which will very shortly be published on the platform website, of course, is a long report with the rationale. If I may, I'd like to take a moment to thank the platform members and the additional experts supporting this work, as well as the Commission directorates who have contributed so much technical input. We've had over 100 private sector experts working on these criteria, with dozens of experts from the Commission supporting this work. Now, the webinar today will have three parts. We will make a presentation from the rapporteurs explaining the work. Then we'll have a panel of platform members and experts to discuss the ideas and what's new and interesting about these environmental objectives. Finally, we will have questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature that we have on Zoom. Please refrain from using the chat. If possible, we favor the Q&A feature to go through the questions in the open discussion at the end. If I may, I'd like to thank Climate Bonds Initiative for supporting us with the technical side of putting on this event today, and we appreciate their support. So, if we may commence, I'll introduce the rapporteurs. First, we have Marzia Traverso, who is Head and Full Professor at the Institute of Sustainability in Civil Engineering at RWTH Arkham University. And of course, her colleague, Dr. Ben Allen. Ben is the Interim Executive Director and Research Director at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. They are the rapporteurs, as we say, of the technical working group of the platform. And Ben and Marzia, I'll now pass over to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Nathan. I'm going to share my screen, share my slides.
Yeah.
So Marzia and I will go through this. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. Someone just nod to me so you can see that on the screen. Perfect. Good. Thank you, and thanks, Nathan, for the introductions. As you say, this accompanies a long report, so we're going to try and run through how we got there with the report, the criteria that we've developed at a level of detail where it helps you then read through that report, understand the criteria, how they were put together. And when we go into our panel discussion, we'll start to bring to life some of the criteria and some of the challenges we faced in doing this and how we've overcome them. Marzia and I will share the presentation. I'll present the first part and then hand over to Marzia as we go through. The first part focuses really on kind of what it is we did, the methodological approach that we took. As we've already heard, our primary focus has been on what we call the Taxo 4 objectives: circular economy, pollution prevention and control, water and marine resources, biodiversity and ecosystems. There are actually a couple of criteria in our recommendations that address climate change adaptation, and we did also look into some mitigation criteria as well. But our primary focus is on these 4, building the taxonomy to cover the full scope of its 6 objectives. Our work is in 2 parts. There is a methodological report which describes the process we went through, all the details and considerations that we made, some of the recommendations that we have to the Commission, and then the annex. And I think the annex is where a lot of people will have a lot of interest, because that's what contains the detail of the criteria and of the sectors and activities that we've covered, against which financial institutions will report, but also the sectors themselves can see what sort of performance standards they're looking at in the context of the taxonomy. Underpinning all of the work we do is the Taxonomy Regulation itself. And when we develop criteria, our technical screening criteria, we have various minimum things that we need to do in terms of forming those criteria. They need to be science-based, evidence-based. They need to leverage existing work where we have it. They need to be adaptable. They represent activities covering CapEx and OpEx, and they need to be easy to use as well. So we're aware that setting performance standards is a challenge in setting them itself, but also then how you report, measure, integrate within existing systems and existing reporting guidelines. In terms of the taxonomy regulation, the criteria themselves, the activities themselves, to be taxonomy aligned, must substantially contribute to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives as defined in the regulation. They must do no significant harm to any and all of the other environmental objectives defined in that regulation, and they must comply with minimum safeguards. And these are things like the UN guiding principles and OECD guidelines relating to human rights and so on. So our focus and our challenge has been, what does substantially contribute mean? How do we define that for our 6 environmental objectives? And how do we apply that then in the context of the many different activities and sectors that we've covered? And what also do we do in the context of do no significant harm? Oops. Before we get into the detail of some of that, and we'll hear a bit of that through the panel discussion, just a little bit about how we've worked as a group. Nathan's already said this has involved hundreds of people, a close working relationship with within the platform, but also with some of the Commission services advising us. But from our side, from the TWG, the technical working group of the platform, one of its subgroups, we've had a composition which has included environmental experts in each of our sector teams, because our focus is on substantially contributing to these environmental objectives. We have experts in each, and we'll describe what we mean by sector teams in a moment. Each of our teams that's focused on a group of activities. So we have experts for water, for biodiversity, circular economy, pollution, but also mitigation and adaptation. I know they're grayed out here on the slide, but we wanted to make sure that in the work we did, we were also recognizing what had been done before on climate, and also the work that we were contributing towards on adaptation as well. We also have these experts represented across all the different activities as appropriate, where those activities are contributing to a given objective, to make sure we're joining up between what we say for, say, water, delivering water in one of the sectors, one of the activity sets, and what we're saying on delivering water in another activity. So there's a symmetry to and a connection between what we do across all of our activities. Again, I'm realizing I'm talking quickly. A lot of this detail is in the front end of the report that's being launched today, and it's also backed up by a report which is being published today as well by the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission that contains a lot of the methodology which we followed. our basic approach, in terms of if we consider this as a project and what we've worked through, we had 3 broad steps. And I'll go into a little bit of the detail about the methodological process in a moment. But essentially, we've been defining technical screening criteria for activities that can make that substantial contribution for what we call objectives 3 to 6. So this is, again, circular economy, pollution prevention and control, water and marine, biodiversity and ecosystems. Part of that process is included as looking at defining a level of environmental ambition for those 4 environmental objectives. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but that's effectively articulating for, say, biodiversity and ecosystems, the equivalent of what we have as the Paris Agreement and emission reductions targets that we have for mitigation. How do we see that? What is our performance ultimate ambition level that we're looking for a given objective? And we need that in order to then develop our substantial contribution criteria. Through that process, through those 2 first steps, that's led us to the development of technical screening criteria and our do no significant harm criteria for the different activities. The methodology, and this is at the bottom of your screen, you will see the very long reference to the report that's coming out from the JRC today. Our methodology and rationale is set at the beginning of our process. It's evolved from work that's gone before on the taxonomy, specifically to address the new environmental objectives. Our starting point for this whole process has been, well, we needed to define a set of economic activities that we would cover. We were given a pre-prioritized set of activities that could contribute to having the greatest impact on these additional 4 environmental objectives. So which activities are the most impactful, which ones need the most change, which ones can have the largest positive impact on these objectives, and therefore, how can we include them within the taxonomy? What are the performance standards and criteria we need to define? Of course, we couldn't tackle the entirety of the economy. It's just too big a challenge. So we've had a subset of the economy. You'll see that listed in the main report, and that's reflected in our criteria and the different activities. The steps to defining our technical screening criteria, I'll run through these very briefly. It's an 8-step process that we've gone through, and this has taken us quite a number of months to get to this point. Describing the nature of the contribution that could be made by an activity, by an economic activity towards an environmental objective. So how can it contribute? What is the scope of that activity? What are we talking about in terms of a system boundary? How broad a definition or narrow a definition do we put on a given activity? Is it very specifically the manufacturing of a photovoltaic cell, for example, that you might have for a mitigation activity? Or is it a broader scope of activities around a desalination plant or construction of buildings, which would include multiple different buildings, multiple different structures, and so on? And that affects how we then consider and what we need to consider for substantial contribution. We define the type of contribution that can be made, and there's multiple different ways that you can contribute substantially to a given objective. And again, those are set out in detail, both in our report in summary, but in a lot more detail in the JRC report. So you can read how those types of contributions can be made. Identifying reference points, and this is a crucial step. This is where in existing regulations and policy, or even in existing standards, where we can say, well, this is what's happening already, and these are specific ways in which these activities are contributing or can contribute. Can we learn from that? Are they sufficient to define substantial contribution? Do we need to do more? And what is it that we need to do more? So identifying those and being clear and making the connections. Selecting the approach to developing the criteria. So this is similar to the type of contribution, but it's exactly how that criteria materializes in practice. And then this is a crucial one, setting that level of ambition. How far and what contribution can be made by a given activity? Not any activity cannot obviously deliver the entirety of the objective of the headline ambition itself. For those that are familiar with climate, it would be the equivalent of saying, this activity will stop climate change or mitigate climate change. Obviously, that's not going to happen, and every activity can contribute at a different level and in a different way. So we needed to set that level of ambition for each of our each of our economic activities for each of our environmental objectives. And then the process of developing our criteria, substantial contribution, and do no significant harm, reflecting all of those previous steps. I realize that's quite a quick run through of what has been a very detailed process that we've gone through. It's a very detailed and rigorous methodology. It's taken months and months of work, but it gives you a headline of the steps that we took to get to that point. And again, you can read that detail in our reports. To give you an idea, just a snapshot of what a substantial contribution can mean for a given economic activity. So that was one of the steps in our process. We can do that in two broad ways. One is through own performance. So this is where the activity itself makes the contribution directly. And it can do that in one of two ways. It can improve the state of the environment. So it can make a direct positive improvement or direct positive contribution to that environment. So that could be, for example, restoring an ecosystem, improving water quality, something of that nature. We also consider that a substantial contribution can be made by reducing the pressure on the environment. So that could be reducing the level of pollution that is coming from an activity, and therefore, by reducing that pressure, you are having a positive and substantial contribution to improving an environmental objective. There's then the other side of the picture, which is where an activity can make a substantial contribution to an objective by directly enabling another activity to make a contribution. So enabling activities are a crucial part of the taxonomy. It's part of our ongoing work. We have some in our criteria that are being launched today. They're primarily around the climate adaptation objective, but we're working on the scope of what a specific enabling activity can be. How does it have to contribute to making that substantial contribution? This is part of ongoing work, but essentially it is an activity that would allow something to happen. Again, in a climate context, it may be the installation of, the manufacturing of a wind turbine blade that then allows a wind turbine to be deployed that can generate renewable energy and mitigate climate change. So the activity would then be the manufacturing of that wind turbine blade, which allows the subsequent activity to make the actual substantial contribution. And the process we've had to go through is thinking, well, what are the enabling activities and processes that would relate to, say, biodiversity, to pollution, to water, and to the circular economy? So that gives you a brief idea of what we consider to be a substantial contribution: own performance, improving the state, reducing the pressure, or enabling another activity. And those are then used to build the different criteria that we've got for our different activity sets. I've been alluding throughout this process that we needed a headline ambition level for our different environmental objectives, and we've had to develop that within the scope of what's written within the Taxonomy Regulation. A lot of what we needed is there, but it's not specific enough when it comes to setting individual performance criteria. So part of our process, part of our methodology, was to set out what it is we considered to be the end state where we wanted to get to with a given objective. What do we want to have achieved for biodiversity and ecosystems? What do we want to achieve for the circular economy? And that is detailed again in our report, and you can read the detail of how we consider that and the recommendations that we're making on what that should be. We had a hierarchy of principles to go through. We must be science-based. We would base them on international agreements where they exist, like, for example, the Paris Agreement, in our case, the Convention on Biological Diversity for the biodiversity objective. We must reflect the EU's response to those international agreements or EU leadership of an objective where appropriate. And that just reflects that the taxonomy is originating in Europe, that we are already committed and signed up to delivering some of our international agreements with specific targets and in a specific way. But we needed the international context because the taxonomy is internationally applicable. In some cases, we don't have those international agreements, and the EU is taking a leading role, and it is defining its own contribution for a given objective. An own ambition level for a given objective. And we've adopted those where appropriate and built on them. A crucial element to this is that setting that headline ambition level needed to be independent of sectoral policy and sectoral scope. So it needed to reflect the environmental objective, not a specific given sector and how that could contribute. For us, that takes place later in our process when we think about the activity and how it can actually meet a headline ambition level. To give you a quick example of what a headline emission level looks like, we have one here for, this is the one we use for biodiversity and ecosystems. I'll read it very briefly. To ensure that by 2050, all of the world's ecosystems, so it's obviously much broader than the EU, and their services are restored to good ecological condition, they're resilient, and they're adequately protected. The objectives of the EU Biodiversity Strategy will be achieved at latest by 2030. And from today, the world's biodiversity needs to be put on the path to recovery, and no deterioration in conservation trends and status of all protected habitats and species by 2030 will be ensured. Why is this important to us? Once we have these articulations, which we've now got, and they're in our report, is we can look at them from an activity perspective and say, how can this activity help ensure that by 2050, the world's ecosystems and their services are restored? Which ecosystems and services are relevant to this activity? What is our scope? How can it contribute? How can it make a difference to resilience? How can it make a difference to protection? How can it ensure no deterioration through the activity itself? Is the activity causing harm in some way? How can we avoid that? And that helps us, once we've got this framing right, it helps us then think from that activity perspective about what a substantial contribution can be and how far that activity can go towards helping in reach this headline ambition level, noting that no single activity could meet this objective headline ambition level in and of itself. So that's been a crucial step in the process. And again, you'll see those written out in our work. And the final slide from me before I hand to Marzia is just to recognize the interaction between the objectives. None of these objectives that we're focusing on here sit alone. And we could have added climate into this, both mitigation and adaptation as well. There's overlap between all of our environmental objectives, and they relate to one another. Pollution, for example, we can talk about water pollution as a specific thing we need to address. But when we talk about the water objective, the chemical status or the ecological status of water is influenced by pollutants or by particulate contents. The same is true of biodiversity and ecosystems. We can think about just terrestrial ecosystems, but of course there are also freshwater and marine ecosystems which are part of the water objective. So defining the substantial contribution to a given objective has also involved us thinking about the other environmental objectives that are related and involved. And that's particularly where our do no significant harm criteria come in, which have to address all the other environmental objectives, but also how we define where specifically is an economic activity interacting with a given objective. One thing we have done, which I think might come up a bit later in our presentation, and again, you should see this in our report, is once we got to the state of having criteria for all of our objectives and all our activities, we looked across them all and said, well, are there connections? Are there consistency? Is there consistency in the way we've treated the different objectives and the activities relative to those different objectives? That's all I'll say for the moment, and I'll hand over to Marzia for remaining slides.
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me properly?
I can hear you well.
Okay, thanks. So the next slides will be more, we will focus a bit more on what is the content of the report. So I was stuck to the report because, I mean, you see already part of the content, at least for the first part. Before to go in the details of the report, this first slide gives you an overview of what is our work, what has been done in our work. So you see from the left side what we get at the beginning as a mandate. So we received 55 activities that has been analyzed and considered for at least one of the environmental objectives. So more than one usually. That's why we start actually with 105 technical screening criteria that's been given to the technical working group from the European Commission. It was being prioritized as a first set work. And then, but then, of course, looking at the set of the activity, we directly realized that there was a necessity to include further people, further experts to our work. So that's why we actually work from, I would say, from December 2020, November 2020 already. So we start with enrolling more people, more experts, and we reach around 100 people that have been grouped in 10 different sectors. You will see in the next slide, and that have been successfully managed to develop 130 technical screening criteria by today. That will be launched today. And the next, and in May, we hope to deliver also further 18 technical screening criteria. So the next slide, please, Ben. So as I said, there was a necessity to enroll different people, and they were grouped. You see, this is an overview of our work, our sector teams. So the sector teams has these 10 that work on different sectors, where also the sector actually were grouped, because of if we have energy from one side and transport, on the other side we have a manufacturing, also chemical, rubber and plastics, pharmaceutical product and preparation, for example. That's a more complex, to take together different kind of production process, manufacturing process. So also in the sector team, it's important to say that we had representatives of different stakeholders. So we have not only scientists, but also the representatives of the industries, representatives of the NGOs, representatives of the finance sector. That was important to already in the development of the technical screening criteria, be able to develop those criteria in a feasible and applicable way. That's why we need data and perspective from the industries as well as from the science. So, of course, science-based, as we say, that was our priority, but of course it's still feasible and applicable. So this was a starting point, but actually, we realized that before the consultation, the mining and processing sector needs further work, needs further details. That's why we were not able. That's why, next slide, please. We are today actually, the taxo for today include the sector that are reported in this slide. So excluding mining, that means nothing is lost. The work has been done, was not presented in the consultation process, but we already collect in the consultation process some feedback, because we prepare specific questions for this sector to get some feedback, even if the technical criteria were not there yet. So, but that's work is still going on, and will be part of the deliverable in the future. What is still ongoing is what you see in this slide. I mean, in this slide you see what will be probably we are planning to deliver in May. So we have a forestry, we have a bioenergy, we have a part, because actually construction buildings is already some technical criteria already there, but we need to need further work as well. For example, for manufacturing, we have pharmaceutical and chemical product that needs further work, and the transport, maritime and land needs also in that case further work. In transport, for example, for land, we have urban and suburban public transport that is already published today, but further efforts must be done for the passengers transport. Going more. I mean, the next slide is more a guide for a reader, I would say, yes. I will go through a couple of slides, not long, to give an idea how you can consult, how you can orient yourself among 700 of the annex and more than 500, the pages of report. So we have first part. First part is more the methodological give you an overview of the methodological aspect that we have been considered, how we went through the development technical screening criteria, starting, of course, from a general overview of the taxonomy and really a summary of the methodology for developing techniques criteria, because the details is given by the JRC report that's published also today. And then we also give you a bit more details on what is how we interpret, how we could define the headline ambition levels, and also the understand the interpretation that we had of the different environmental objectives. As already was said by Ben, we Taxo 4 take care of objectives that has very broad. So we are talking about transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control. They include several indicators, several also normatives and references. So that's why we need also to in our work to define what is our system, what are our system boundaries. And then in the last part, we give a recommendation and reflection for the future work of the platform to not lose any of the lessons learned actually that we have in this more than one and a half years of work. Next slide, give you the annex 2. So actually the annex, the part B of the report, that is mainly the technical screening criteria. So you have chapters. The chapters are not like, they are not directly taken from the sector teams. Few of them, yes, other were split a bit to summarize. Manufacturing, for example, is together. But then you can, according to your sector, your interest, you can directly go to the sector that is your interest and then see there how actually is structured the technical screening criteria. Next slide. We will have, so each of technical screening criteria, you will have as first a description of activity, so which NACE code includes, which is the substantial contribution for which environmental objective have been the technical screening criteria developed, and then the description of the technical screening criteria, so how actually all the description, how actually has to be meet to be aligned with taxonomy. And then, of course, the last part is on the do not significant harm. And then finally, for all the other files, and then finally a rationale that include how actually, which are the data, which are the background that's been used to develop this technical screening criteria. Next slide. So I give you just one example very briefly, and then we move to our panel discussion. So, for example, for the plastic manufacturing of plastics packaging goods, we specify the NACE code C22.2.2, and then we have worked on the substantial contribution to transition to a circular economy. And there you have directly, the activity that's been taxonomy eligible need to meet either the criteria for use of circular feedstock and design for recycling in practice, or the criteria for design for reuse in practice and design for recycling in practice. So we have take both perspectives. One could be more focused on feedstock and of course recycling design for recycling, but then also reuse, specifically design for reuse and design for recycling. Next slide, that would be the last from my side. When I just give you the example of the first part for feedstock, so clearly a criteria, so at least 85% of the packaging and product by weights consist of mechanical recycled post, consumer material, chemical, recycled, bio-based, or carbon capture and rejection-based materials. And a list for design of product, there are a list of criteria that must be met. So that's, few of them are, three of them are reported in this slide, but there is a longer list. Also to include more all the aspects that are related to the circular economy. The circular economy, I use this technical screening criteria to give an example, because give you the idea of the complex work that's been done in the Taxo 4. In particular, because of the the type of environmental objective that we have handled in our work. Thank you for your attention, and happy to answer to your question in the session for the question. And I give back, Ben, the words to you for the panel.
Thanks, Mattia. I'll just say one thing before just going back to Nathan, is we realize this is a lot to take in. We're trying to compress basically 18 months worth of work into 20 minutes of presentation. We do plan to have, we haven't scheduled them yet, but we do plan to have follow-up webinars focused on our environmental objectives, specifically talking about the activities that are relevant to those objectives, to get into a bit of detail that we won't have time to get in today. But in our panel, we'll go into some of the challenges and how we've addressed some of those things. But I'll just give the word to Nathan while I stop sharing screen, in case there's anything I need to cover.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Martia. Well done on the presentation. And as Ben said, more to come in future. We'll take a bit of a deeper dive now with a panel discussion, trying to draw out some of the depths of insights around circular economy, around biodiversity, and doing some compare and contrast with adaptation, because people will remember that we had adaptation criteria and rationale in the first delegated act and recommendations from the technical process. And we've learned a lot about how to set criteria for these different objectives. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists to go through this discussion. So the first is Anna Creed, and Anna is Associate Director of Thought Leadership at the Climate Bonds Initiative and has been leading a lot of our land-based work on the platform. And we have Michael de Smet, who is Sustainable Investment Expert at the National Bank of Belgium. And we have Linda Romanowska, and Linda is an independent expert on the platform, but also a climate resilience expert and a researcher at the University of New South Wales. So Ben, back to you. Try and go for about 25 minutes if you can, please.
I'll do my best, Nathan, and appreciate if you flag to me if I'm running over. Just to say, I think from all of us, so Michiel, Anna, Linda, these are the people that have done the actual detailed work of setting the criteria and so on. Matthew and I have been guiding the process, but these are the people that have run sector teams. They've acted as our environmental experts. So they are the best place to give you some of this detail here. I'm going to ask a general framing question to each of you in turn, and maybe a little bit specifically about what I know the work you've been doing. I'll start with Michiel to give him a heads up. Essentially, can you give us an idea about what we were trying to achieve in terms of substantial contribution to the objective you were focused on, and some examples from the criteria in your activity sector? And as a second question, as an environmental objective lead within the process that we've gone through, how you worked through ensuring consistency in approach. I'll remind you of the second question after the first. Michiel.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. And let me take the opportunity to thank you, Ben, Martia, and Nathan for your great leadership in the past 18 months. So what is it we try to achieve with substantial contribution? Well, when we think about circular economy, we're talking about system change. And that's difficult to capture in one single metric, as for example, also is the case with biodiversity. So one of the aims here was to ensure that we exploit the full range of levers towards a circular economy. So to give an example, one of the activities we've dealt with is the manufacturing of food products and beverages. Now, in order to substantially contribute to the circular economy, one could pull different levers. It could be about elimination of problematic or unnecessary packaging. It could be about shifting towards reusable packaging in practice at scale. Or it could be about designing your packaging items for recycling and ensuring that recycling is happening in practice at scale. Again, ensuring that that substantial contribution takes place in society. And that immediately also shows some of the challenges. In this case, as a food producer, to substantially contribute, very often you're dependent on other steps in that supply chain. So as we're trying to shift the system, we have to ensure that activities and the technical screening criteria for different activities are aligned, that we create similar incentives that point towards the same direction. And that then links to your second question, how did we ensure that consistency? Well, we did so in different ways. I think first of all, there's that headline ambition level you already discussed. So we have a headline ambition statement for the circular economy. Throughout the process, we could go back to that statement and actually compare different technical screening criteria. Think, for example, about the use of recycled materials and what share can actually substantially contribute or counts as a substantial contribution. And here we've been also working together with JRC to get that consistency straight from a high level top-down point of view. Another lever we used was the circular economy environmental experts group, where we discussed new concepts, think about new circular business models. How do we go about those business models and describing them across different activities to ensure that consistency? Think, for example, about secondhand sale in furniture or fashion, or new product as a service models where people have access to fashion items, but not necessarily buy the item itself, so do not get the ownership. How do you translate that into technical screening criteria, and how can you ensure that it leads to environmental benefits, that it actually is substantially contributing? This is one of the many topics that we discussed with circular economy experts. And then finally, we also discussed between different sector teams, we discussed very concrete challenges or very concrete topics. And to take Marcia's example of the manufacturing of plastic packaging goods and go back to the food manufacture, even though we have two different activities, one has to ensure that the incentives or the technical screening criteria are aligned because they're part of the same supply chain. Yes, you'd have other types of packaging, not just plastic packaging. And yes, you'd have certain plastic packaging that doesn't end up as food packaging, but ends up as other type of goods packaging. But you want to ensure that consistency. And here, to give a very concrete example, we discussed the inclusion or exclusion of pre and post consumer recycled content. So that would be a very particular topic, very detailed. So I think across those different levels, we try to ensure consistency in what really delivers substantial contribution to the circular economy. So I think that, yeah, that would answer your questions, I guess.
It does, thank you, Michiel. And it's every of our environmental objectives have had its particular challenge. I think circular economy as a state change objective, as a system change objective, has been particularly challenged, and it really highlights that linkages between the different activities that we have. You've given a good example of one. And we've had to address those questions of, well, if we're setting performance criteria for manufacturing, for example, that may have an impact, or we may need to consider, well, what are the performance criteria we need in a sector that's producing raw materials or a sector that's dealing with waste to make that link with the circular economy? And that, I think, it's been a new challenge for us in this context beyond what we had before in climate. Thank you. I'm going to go through all of our panelists just to make sure we all get the opportunity to speak, and then we might circle back. And I'm going to come to you next. So you've had a very specific and different set of challenges to address, because you've, within your sector team, have been focusing on the biodiversity elements. So I'll ask you the general framing question again. What were you trying to achieve in terms of substantial contribution to your objective, and some examples of how you've gone through that, the criteria, and how you've addressed those challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and hello, everybody. Yeah, per the presentation that Ben gave earlier, in the guidance document we received when we started this process about what can contribute as substantial contribution to biodiversity and ecosystems, there were these three possible routes: one about reducing the pressures, two about improving the state of the environment, and three about whether the activity can enable either of those things in another activity. So we really started the process by trying to identify what are the ways in which the activities we were looking at could improve the state of the environment and biodiversity and ecosystems, and what are the ways that have significant pressures that can be reduced. So we started with a kind of bottom-up approach to really think about the activities and how it impacts on the environment and vice versa. So for animal production, for example, we're talking about the impacts of land conversion and crop and soil, nutrient, water, waste, energy management practices and land use inherent in the feed, manure and housing systems. So it led to us identifying things like issues around grazing intensification, or the emission of pollutants from fertilizers or pharmaceuticals, or pesticides as well, those kind of pollutants. the impacts that has on biodiversity. Again, that links to Ben's point earlier about these objectives are very interlinked. So we were coming at it from a biodiversity perspective, but those things impact on biodiversity and ecosystems through the water systems often and through the air. So we are very linked to these other objectives as well. Things like the clearing and fragmentation of natural or semi-natural vegetation, or the loss of habitats in the landscape that are beneficial for biodiversity, various other management practices that might be a direct harm to biodiversity. I'm listing all these out because it kind of highlights our first key challenge when thinking about biodiversity there's many different aspects of biodiversity. So I worked in the TEG previously when we were developing criteria for mitigation adaptation. And climate change at least has the single goal of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But when you're talking about biodiversity and ecosystems, there's many parts to that we want to tackle simultaneously, not just in how we tackle it, but the impacts we want to have. It's not just on one goal of one pollutant like biodiversity is. So that was a big challenge for us. And I might come on to that a bit more later about how to get, and it's a usability challenge as well about the complexity or the sheer volume of criteria, to be honest, that you might come up with when you're addressing biodiversity. So that was a big concern and challenge for us around how to get our heads around just the diversity and the number of interactions between the activity and biodiversity and the ecosystems and how to capture that in the criteria. But there is a lot of science-based evidence out there which addresses all of that. It's just working through it all. The bigger challenge really is what's a substantial contribution. So what's big enough to be substantial and not just do no significant harm to some of these goals. And that's where a lot of the expert debate lay. And really we focused on, going back to the initial objectives, if we were talking about reducing pressures, it was reducing pressures to the extent that they can enable the system or biodiversity to really recover and get back to healthier forms, essentially. So it wasn't just a small reduction, it had to be a substantial reduction. And so here we've got criteria really addressing nutrient loss, basically, and trying to put a limit on those so that the system can recover and address eutrophication and issues like that, essentially. And as well as that, adapting, creating and enhancing local habitats that are good for biodiversity in a substantial way. So not just small features, but actually large landscapes that really are supporting and enabling biodiversity to flourish and thrive and ecosystems to be healthy off the back of that. We were guided by EU policies. The EU Biodiversity Strategy is an obvious one, Farm to Fork is another, all those kind of strategies within the EU and the directives. But we could go beyond that where we felt it was necessary and the science was pointing us to go beyond some of the existing policies and goals. So we took that as a baseline, but not as a limitation on what we were trying to do. We were really mindful of the importance of ensuring all the substantial contribution criteria across all objectives for a particular activity kind of an equivalent ambition level, so that we wouldn't have this kind of issue of potential criteria shopping. Mindful that compliance with the taxonomy means just substantial contribution to one goal and do no significant harm to the other 5. So there was consistency checks that were going on by the JRC and other parties to see are we doing something equivalent here within an activity and also across activities. So that was an important check in the process, really, as we all had our heads down focusing on one subset of the Taxo 4 criteria. So I think that's my overview, Ben, I think.
Wonderful, thanks Anna. And I think people are probably in our audience starting to get a picture of the process we've gone through with criteria setting has been obviously the normal challenges associated with criteria setting, which the TEG experienced with respect to climate, but also then breaking this new ground on understanding the new environmental objectives, how they work in practice, the different challenges that they bring into this process. And it's been great to work with you on this process because of your expertise in the former TEG and then having reflections on how that's been different. I'm going to go to Linda now, just to make sure we cover all of our panel before circling back. Linda, you acted as our adaptation expert. You were our lead expert on that, coordinating across the different sector teams within the TWG. So same question to you in terms of, what were we trying to achieve in terms of substantial contribution for that objective, for adaptation? And if you could give some examples of criteria, but also it's a slightly unusual one because it's a very consistent approach to to dealing with an environmental objective. So maybe a reflection on that from what's gone before in the climate DA. Linda, please.
Thanks, Ben, and pleasure to be here tonight. Maybe I also want to start with extending my big thanks to all the platform and technical working group colleagues for their incredible dedication and collaboration that has led to this result, and when we are here today presenting that. On adaptation, as with all other objectives, the criteria for substantial contribution to adaptation aim to support very specific EU policy targets, including international commitments in this area. And the EU strategy on adaptation to climate change actually gives us a good guidance on where EU wants to go and what EU wants to achieve in terms of resilience to climate change impact. It says that the EU will be a climate resilient society, fully adapted to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And the strategy is aiming that by 2050, EU as a whole will have reinforced adaptive capacity and minimized vulnerability to climate impact. And so we take this overarching policy goal and we think, okay, how do we now translate into that economic activity context? And the overarching aim from the economy perspective is to achieve an economy that is resilient to various climate change hazards. And for an economy as a whole to be resilient, we need economic activities that are able to function in current and projected future climate conditions without major interruptions and financial losses. And we also need to make sure that the infrastructure and the assets that these economic activities in our communities heavily depend on are also resilient. In addition, we also need to strengthen those parts of the economy which act as enablers of resilience beyond their own boundaries. Those activities that increase the resilience of broader communities, of nature, of cultural heritage, of assets, of other economic activities, as it is already foreseen in the Taxonomy Regulation. In reality, the reality currently is that there are almost no economic activities in our economy which will not be impacted by climate change in one way or another to a differing extent. Either because by their nature, they are heavily dependent on stable climatic and weather conditions, or because they have assets located or they operate in certain areas that are exposed to major climate risks. We can name a few: floods, heat waves, forest fires, storms, or they can also be affected through indirect effects, for example, through impacts on their workforce, on their productivity levels, their employees, or indirect impacts through their supply chains, value chains. And those impacts may happen anywhere around the globe, in fact. And so what we aim to promote, first and foremost, with the criteria, is the awareness of the exposure and vulnerability level among companies through appropriate climate change risk and vulnerability assessments, because not knowing your risks and exposures in the face of overwhelming evidence of the already occurring and projected climate change impact, it cannot really be seen as responsible business management nowadays. And of course, where those assessments then identify important material risks, there needs to be an action taken by companies to develop, first of all, develop well-planned adaptation or resilience strategies, action plans. And then there also needs to be an implementation of these planned adaptation measures, which address and manage the identified risks and achieve substantial risk reduction. So again, to achieve substantial contribution, it's not enough just to do something or implement a few measures. No, you do have to achieve substantial risk reduction, because only this way we can collectively hope to achieve the EU goal of becoming a climate resilient society, adapted to climate change and having a resilient economy. And so this is what the adaptation criteria require. In terms of the activity examples and how they contribute, what we have included in the report are, on one hand, activities which in and of themselves can be seen as adaptation measures. For example, infrastructure for flood risk prevention. We also have activities which when they are adapted or done in a resilient way themselves, they automatically also enable other economic activities or communities to be more adapted. And we also have significant emphasis on a range of emergency response activities, which are really our frontline protection when climate-related disasters do occur. And to that last point of view on the alignment with the previous criteria, which are already in the first delegated act, we, as you know, we did not reinvent the wheel on adaptation criteria. We took the path of staying fully consistent with the criteria in the first delegated act to avoid possible confusion and unnecessary complexity and so on. However, there was also a lot of work, first of all, in defining the activities themselves and their scope and their boundaries. There was also a lot of work on defining the do no significant harm criteria. And maybe if I may add, as someone who is interacting closely with the various entities who are taxonomy users and who will be reporting on taxonomy alignment very soon, both in financial and non-financial sectors, I witness still, although we've already had these criteria and we haven't changed them, we use the same criteria, I witness a lot of unanswered questions in the market about adaptation and a high level of confusion around these criteria. So although we have kept it simple, I think there's a lot of additional work that needs to be done on guiding and explaining and communicating about these adaptation criteria, the correct interpretation and application. And I do hope that together with the Commission, we can move towards that communication.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. And just to reiterate, it's been a genuine intellectual pleasure working with you and Michiel on some of these challenges. There is a lot of work still to do in this space. I think you touched on a couple of points. I'm looking down to my right here because that's where I'm writing notes. Is this idea of an economy-wide challenge, that the economy itself needs to be adapted? I think that's true of some of our other objectives as well, and that it is the impact of the economy and the way we operate the economy that has the impact on these environmental objectives. And it's just doing one thing on one activity will not help us reach, well, it will help us to reach our headline, but it will not get us all the way to reaching our headline. I was alluding to this perhaps poorly during the presentation as well. Our headline objectives are their headline. They're up there. They're an aspirational thing, but all these activities need to come together. And I think that touches on another point, which I'll ask you all to reflect on in a moment, is at the moment we're building the taxonomy. And this now signals the point where we've got, or making recommendations on additional criteria to cover these other 4 environmental objectives. Then we will have a set of the full 6, but only a relatively few economic activities covered in general. We don't cover everything in the economy as a whole, and that's an ongoing process that will take time to build. The question I want to put, and for you to all raise hands and give me a very quick reaction, 1 or 2 minutes, is perspectives then on whether or not now, having gone through this process, thinking about these 4 environmental objectives, or the specific ones you're interested in and are focused on, have we learned things that we could now reflect back on what was done before on the climate objectives? Because we've had this extra time to think about taxonomy, about how it works, about activities and about their connections. Any reflections or reactions on that from anyone? Michiel, please.
Happy to go first and give the others some more time to think. My immediate reaction to the question, taking my circular economy perspective, would be how we, in order to get substantial contribution, again, taking circular economy, environmental objective, we really need to look at an entire sector, an entire supply chain, and sometimes even go beyond one supply chain. So if we want to achieve decarbonization, and then also covering the energy transition story, but first and foremost, focusing on production and consumption systems, one has to go beyond one activity. And again, giving an example from a circular economy file that we've dealt with, we not only looked at the specific step of food manufacturing and packaging for food, but we also went as far as trying to understand where does the wood come from that is being used, or the pulp come from that has been used for the cardboard, or where does the what type of polymer has been used, and then all the other going down that supply chain. The other side, it's about, will that packaging actually be reused? Will that packaging be recycled? So in order to get to substantial contribution, rather than having that activity focused lens that we've been taking, my insight would be, how can we better connect different activities and align entire supply chains, align the entire economy to work towards that lighthouse that we've set ourselves, whether that's the headline ambition or other policy strategies that are out there. So yeah, it would be a message of trying to connect different activities, working together, reinforcing in a concerted effort our steps toward that common direction.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michiel. Conscious of our time, so I'd like to conclude this bit of the panel in 3 minutes, but I will offer, obviously, to Anna and to Linda before I go to Marzia. So Anna, Linda, do you want to add anything to what Michiel said, something different?
Yeah, I think Michiel's point is a really good one. I'm going to say something which might be a bit controversial, but it's quite difficult, because obviously when we did mitigation adaptation, we did do no significant harm to biodiversity, pollution, prevention and control. And now separately, latterly, we've done substantial contribution. And separating those two things into 2 stages made perfect sense. We have to start somewhere, but actually it would be worth a review of, okay, have we got the gap right between the two? Are they working on a consistent basis, so that you can think about an objective in its entirety and then make sure we're all squared up within that objective for that activity at the 2 levels of performance. We did mitigation, substantial contribution, doing significant harm together, and I think there's value in that as well. So I think just that kind of double check back actually to the do no significant harm elements that went alongside substantial contribution to the climate objectives would be helpful. And I know that's something that's in the mix for later. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna, and thank you for being brief. Linda, do you want to add anything, any reflections?
Yes, I'll just add specifically from the adaptation perspective, because the reality was that in the first delegated act, the adaptation was in a way linked and dependent on mitigation activities. So it was pretty much the activities that were defined for mitigation were also included in the adaptation annex, with a couple of additional ones added. And the work on adaptation now has really shown you have to treat it as a objective in its own right, independent of any other objectives, because the reality of or the result of that approach is that there are still certain highly vulnerable activities that are not yet included in the taxonomy. And in this work, we have now really focused on the enabling activities just to maximize that broader economy and society resilience building effect. However, we have to do much more about adapted activities that have to be made resilient in and of themselves and going beyond the activities that are already included under other objectives. So that would be my main recommendation on adaptation. We have also, because we have now done a lot of thinking about the adaptation criteria, and we have seen the first implementation of them, that also some deeper thinking about the criteria might be useful in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. And yeah, all good reflections. And I think, again, it just speaks to the amount of work and learning and thought that's gone into this process. So again, thank you all. And I think for our audience, you've seen now how precise and clear our experts can be, finishing exactly when we wanted them to in the panel. So it gives you an insight into how nice it's been to work with them over the past few months. Marzia, I'm going to give you the opportunity and floor now for the last 5 minutes of the panel, just whether you've got any reflections, additional points you want to add, having heard that, having been through this process from the beginning. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, it was a long trip, I would say, with quite complex, because we had several different sectors and activity, but also different environmental objectives. They were also complex themselves. And also we have to follow the taxonomy rules. It's also the life cycle approach. So we have to, that's why, for example, all the teams works together to address the entire supply chain, as Michiel said, not only for circular economy. Actually, we did, the approach was there, and we tried to address. So you can imagine how complex it was. 1,000 people working, 100 people working together for the first time, and addressing with different perspectives, because I think it's also important. We learn each other, not only basing on science, how we should bring the science, the evidence of science on the table and try to build the technical screening criteria that are reliable and feasible for the future, right? So that was an important exercise. It was, of course, it was not easy, but we are now happy to have released. And I would, because I read in the meantime, I read the question, if I may, I would clarify that this is the final report. At least the technical screening criteria that's been published today are the final. There are not consultation on it. Those are our final feedback to the European Commission. And before to pass the word to Nathan, I want to really take the opportunity to thank all the 100 people the experts that worked with us. Without them, that would not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Marzia. And just in case this is unclear to our audience, what you've said there, I'll just reiterate again. These are our recommendations as an expert group, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, to the European Commission. These are our recommendations to the Commission. It will then be for the Commission to take these forwards into a delegated act and for them to do a public consultation on that act as they go forwards. So our recommendations here stop. This is the culmination of that work, and they go forwards to the Commission. Thank you, Marzia. That's a wonderful reflection, and I echo those thanks. Nathan, back to you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Marzia, and thanks to the panelists. Let's try and answer questions. I've allocated your name, panelists, to some of the questions in the answered tab, just so you can have a look, but I'll ask them to you directly. The first one, Marzia, is for you. It's a question about the criteria that we set and whether they reflect regulations that are already in place and follow something like the better regulation principles, or is our purpose here a little different?
I mean, of course, we refer to the reference, to the regulation is already in place, but for us, the regulation taking place usually is do no significant harm. So the starting point, at least as a reference. Then, of course, there are methodology and ISO norm or PEF, Product Environmental Footprint, as an example, that give us the methodology how you can assess and how you can report the indicators, right? So the indicator or the criteria. So that was taken also into consideration in the technical screening criteria. So there are two different levels. One level is more when is something mandatory and it must be respected, is the reference for us to do no significant harm. And then, but then we have to fix the further step to make the substantial contribution. And there, when there is a methodology already in place, when there is already a European direction, and of course the strategies from the European, that was taken into consideration and was integrated. And from there, we define the criteria according to them.
Lovely, Marzia, thank you. Ben, the next question's for you. You used the term environmental pressures early in your presentation, and we've been asked, can we clarify that concept relative to the idea of impact? Can you just explain that?
Thanks, Nathan. So I read the question. I would say we didn't give so much, or we didn't intend to give so much importance to the environmental pressure question. We've worked within the DIPSIA framework, for those that know what that is, the driver, pressure, state, impact, and response framework. So, and that's articulated in our methodology, and you can read more about it in the JRC's methodology as it applies to the work we've done in the taxonomy. What I would say to this question is pressures originate from an activity that can be mitigated within that same activity. Pollution's an easy one to think about. I'm a car, I'm releasing a certain amount of emissions and pollutants, and I can mitigate that by changing the way the car operates or the car is built. So you can address pressures within an activity. The impact is more about what happens to an environmental objective as a result of a pressure. And that's how the DIPSIA framework works. So when we talk about impacts, they will be the impact on an environmental objective, and we deal with activities. So to address that impact, it would be a different activity that mitigates or addresses the impact that has been caused. So the restoration activity, for example, restoration of an ecosystem mitigates and responds to an impact that has been caused on that ecosystem that results from a pressure caused by another economic activity. What we hope to build in the taxonomy overall is we address both the pressures and the impacts through complementary activities. But the quickest way we can make an impact is through addressing the pressures by the activities themselves, improving the performance of an economic activity.
Thank you, Ben. Excellent. Anna, let's go to you. Aquaculture. Can you tell us our thinking on aquaculture activities?
Apologies, thank you. Yeah, it's a very interesting and important one, aquaculture. We had discussion about this in the group when we were working out our kind of scope within fishing. We've made a recommendation in the report that this is picked up and prioritised in the next batch of criteria development. We do really think it has potential for negative impacts that can be reduced, substantially reduced, and positives for, potential for positive impacts and huge innovation. So we do think it should be in the taxonomy. However, given that the issues in aquaculture are quite different to those in fishing, it's not a simple case of just using the same criteria we've already developed. It would need its consideration in its own right. So we couldn't take it on at this time alongside the other activities we were already covering, but not because of its lack of importance, more just a resource availability question. Hence, we would like to see it done rapidly in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question I'll take part of, and then I think, Ben, I need your assistance. So there's no obligation for taxonomy disclosures to be audited in terms of the disclosure obligation. There's no audit obligation on the taxonomy disclosures. However, Ben, some of our criteria do have verification expectations, don't they?
They do. And I can't, off the top of my head, think of a good example, but they do require, in different ways, that a demonstration of substantial contribution having happened has actually happened. And sometimes that requires on-the-ground monitoring and auditing to make sure that it has happened, or that a system is in place as per our criteria that would ensure that it does happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Very good. Linda, on emergency services, you may have briefly discussed, but just give us a quick recap.
Yes, I think the question was on the scope, on what is covered under emergency services. We have a fairly high number of activities there. There are 7 activities under emergency services, and they altogether cover the whole scope of disaster response. So everything that happens as a response to disasters, in this case, disasters that can be related or can be attributed to climate change, would be covered. And that includes emergency health, disaster response, disaster relief, firefighting, hazardous material response, technical protection, and coordination of emergency. So altogether, it would cover the response side of disaster risk management. However, these activities also include some elements of preparedness when these preparedness activities link to these specific areas.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, Ben, the next one is really a question about enabling activities. There was a few questions on this through the deck. Can you just tell us the status of the enabling activities work in more detail, and maybe the idea of why they're there in the taxonomy as well?
Yeah, I can. There's been a lot of work done on this and a lot of thinking done on this within the work we've done. So we do have a number of activities we consider as enabling activities. And we've been writing performance criteria for those activities that allow them to enable, there is no better word in English, to enable another activities to substantially contribute. But we've come up against questions around how direct does that enabling have to be? How close in the supply chain or the value chain does enabling activity have to be present? What is the requirements for the own performance of that activity that enables another activity? So it must obviously do no significant harm, but how much of its own performance does it need to contribute substantially, if at all? And a lot of these questions are coming up because of the way we're needing to take a view on what is written in the taxonomy regulation, because it is clear in legal terms, but not clear when it comes to setting the performance criteria. So a bit like we had with our headline ambition levels, they're very clearly set out in the regulation, but when you come to writing criteria, you need an extra level of precision. So we've had a task force on enabling working within the platform to take forward these conceptual ideas around enabling. I would say we're 80–90% there, but we need to do a little bit more work on that, and we'll be doing that over the coming months with the intention of releasing that thinking and our additional criteria in May. Why are they so important? Well, these types of activities really, there's a potential for a lot of them for a start. So it would allow a lot more finance to be aligned with the taxonomy, and they are essential really to allowing the economy to contribute substantially in some way and to recognize the investments going into those different activities. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So watch this space on more enabling. Marcia, there was a couple of requests just to restate the activities that we're continuing to work on in coming months. Would you mind doing that, please?
No problem. I mean, it will be forestry, there will be pharmaceutical and chemical products, then maritime transport, and completed landed transport, and then I forgot something. The enabling, as we said. Yeah, and I think that's it. No?
And you did say additional agriculture, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Bioenergy, I forgot. Bioenergy, yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So there's quite a bit of work continuing, colleagues.
18. Exactly.
Yeah, very good. Okay, good, thank you. Michael, I would like to come to you. There was a question on packaging and plastic packaging. Are you the right man for that?
Yes, happy to do so.
Do you want me to read it to you?
No, I think I'm looking at the right question here. So the example given in terms of connecting those different activities is a great one on plastic packaging. So we've ensured within the technical working group that the technical screening criteria, in this case for the plastic packaging manufacturer, are aligned when it comes to being able to be recycled or being able to be reused, are aligned with those of the food and beverage manufacturer. So if the food manufacturer buys packaging that is aligned with the taxonomy, it would immediately fit into complying with their criteria. Obviously, for the food manufacturer, we've got some additional criteria when it comes to food waste. So that's one example, but beyond that example, we've been working on food producers and biodiversity, substantial contribution to biodiversity, and there we link to the work done by Anna and the team. So where we immediately say, if a farmer certain agricultural activity is complying with the taxonomy, that output can feed into the ingredient selection of the food producer in terms of substantially contributing to biodiversity. So as far as I know, we've ensured that alignment at activity level, really looking at the technical working group, which activities could link to another. But Marcia and Ben, please correct me if I'm mistaken. I'm not sure whether we already have an overarching framework to accommodate that supply chain. And as I said before, connecting those dots, ensuring that we provide incentives across that sector.
Good.
That's it.
Yeah, Marcia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, usually we do that, and we use the life cycle thinking approach as a base, and that was used for all the. When I mean life cycle thinking approaches, it's not familiar for everyone. It means to try to consider what are the impact or the pressure impact along the manufacturing of a product. So, and the structure of the activity, instead of the work of taxonomy, the work focus more at activity levels, doesn't cover necessarily all the supply chain, all the life cycle. But still, we use this approach in elaborated technical screening criteria, so in a way that the different sector teams, transport, for example, that we were focused on the use phase, but still there was the sector team for the works on the manufacturing, and they work together in a way that all the technical criteria are consistent with it.
Very good, thank you. So Marcia, I think it's you actually on mining. Can you just update
yes.
on our work?
I mean, yeah, I mean, mining, we we have been worked a lot in the first part. There were some difficulties because mining covers different kind of product. So at the beginning, the approach was try to define general criteria that can be valid for all products. So differentiate by raw materials, extraction, and the processing part. So we differentiate at least these two. But still there, we are talking about different kind of materials, and was quite difficult to find an agreement, at least to find the substantial contribution level, because one thing is that do not significant harm, the other thing is what is substantial contribution for which of the, and actually mining has all the, actually we should develop a technical criteria for all the environmental objectives, including climate mitigation. So we start to work. The work has been done until the July. Then we stopped because we realized that we were not ready, or we don't feel confident with what we have. But still, we had some question to get some feedback, general feedback on the status of data in the consultation process. Those was taken by the sector teams, and now the idea is to work further in the next month to see if we can deliver some input by September. But that's still on process, so we are working on it. Hopefully we succeed.
Very good, thank you. Now, I'm going to answer a couple of questions about linkages to our other work. Marzia and Ben, if you would just have a look at the open questions list to see if there's anything else you want to respond to. Ben, I can see your hand up. Was there something you'd like to say?
Just to make a point and to point people to an element of the report, building on what Marzia said, is mining was one of those activities where we had a conversation around the difference between a company and an activity and what that means in taxonomy terms. And that allowed us to explore that thinking. And there's a specific part of the report where we talk about the difference and the link between an economic activity and an asset and how we treat that in taxonomy terms. A company may be able to, and probably does, operate multiple different activities, but we think at the activity level, not at the company level. And that's an important point. That's all.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so there are questions on social taxonomy and on minimum safeguards in the environmental taxonomy. The next step for the platform is to elaborate the implementation of the minimum safeguards part of the environmental taxonomy. And we expect to publish a recommendation on this before the summer. And these obligations would apply when implementing the environmental taxonomy. Social taxonomy is a different step, and the next phase of any work would be for the Commission to respond on that, and then there would need to be a decision about how to take it forward in its own right. But at this stage, there is no regulation on the social taxonomy. There's no requirement for social criteria. That is something for the future. There were several questions on links to the extended taxonomy framework proposal that we released on Monday. Now, there's no formal link between this work and that work either, because that is a proposal, and like the social taxonomy has to be considered by the Commission. Nonetheless, some of the thinking in that report, recognizing that not all activities can substantially contribute, is still very important thinking. And the framework is helpful when setting criteria, because sometimes we just need to be clear the environmental performance of an activity is only making an intermediate contribution between substantial contribution and do no significant harm. And sometimes the performance levels are significantly harmful. So that thinking, that framework is widely useful and applicable, even though there's no regulatory obligation and there's no direct requirement linked to the Taxo development work. I hope that's clear. There were many questions on the publishing timeline. Now, forgive us, we can only answer this question in part as a platform. We've submitted our work. The Commission will respond with a proposal for these criteria to go into law, another delegated act, we expect by the end of 2022. Now, the timing of commencement of regulatory obligations is a question for the Commission, and sorry, we couldn't advise on that. But I imagine in time, once the Commission is ready, it will advise. Just remember, there has to be a scrutiny period of any criteria that are published by the Commission. The precise timing of that is an open question and a matter for the Commission. So forgive us, that's the best we can do on that one today. Now, as we close, Marzia and Ben, I'm just going to ask you any final comment, please, about the content of today, or final message for the audience.
But from my side, as I say, it's a big work, and we are confident that can support the further step of the Commission in developing the second delegated act. And one thing that I want to state again, today was just an overview. We would like to develop further a webinar specifically for sector, where we can go more in details, or environmental objective, that could be both, to go more in details on the technical screening criteria and exchange with the stakeholder. It's the first deliverable from Taxo 4, and yeah, I think I want to again thank you all the technical working group to support us in this. Thank you,
Marzia. Ben?
Just to reflect on a few comments that have come in the Q&A, but not in a level of detail. A few are asking, can we comment on this? Can we give feedback? This is the culmination of work that's taken place over 18 months. It is there as our final recommendations. In the report, you'll see the process of feedback that we went through as well. In summer, we released the criteria for public consultation. We've had multiple rounds of consultation internally within the platform. So there have been a number of loops where we've sought and incorporated feedback from externals as well within the scope. A couple were asking about what updates have we done to climate. It's not been our main focus. Our focus has been on making sure that we get these additional 4 environmental objectives into the taxonomy, working and dedicating our time on them. That has led us to some reflections, but it's not been the primary aim of what we've been doing. That's all that I want to say. I think, yeah, again, thanks to everyone who's contributed.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, well, let's bring it to a close. If I can thank Linda, Anna, and Michael, not just for your fantastic insight today on the panel, but for your dedication over the many months, and to your many colleagues who have worked with the same level of vigor and intellect and commitment. Well done to all of you. And if I may thank Marzia and Ben for your guidance and leadership, deploying your expertise on this very important task. And well done for an excellent session today. Thank you all. We'll now draw the session to a close. Enjoy reading all those pages, everyone, and we'll come back to you with more events